Heat embossing is a great way to trap colour in your card designs, and if you've not tried it before, it is so much fun. Today's cards feature 3 slightly different ways to achieve this, so hopefully you'll find at least one technique you can do for your next papercraft project. Hey, it's Verity here on my YouTube channel and blog Pretty Little Button. If you are new here, I make papercrafting tutorials for the everyday crafter. For the first technique, we are going to trap the colour of the cardstock we are heat embossing on. So for this card, I'm using the Hearts and Twine stamp set from Embossing Powder, and I'm using the large heart stamp from this set. I've got a piece of Juniper Innocent Pink cardstock in my Misty stamping platform, and I'm inking my stamp up with Clear Ultra Slow Drying Embossing ink before stamping this off set to one side on the card. Now I'm repositioning the stamp and stamping this again, creating a trio of 3 hearts down the left hand side, and once all 3 hearts were stamped, it's then ready for the embossing powder. So the embossing powder I'm using is clear gloss embossing powder, which you can get in big pots, perfect if you use a lot of clear gloss. This powder really creates magic, as you heat it up, you really see the stamp design come to life. So as this is clear embossing powder, it will melt and will still show the colour of the card base beneath. The powder will create a gloss look to your stamping, and the gloss will slightly darken the colour underneath. Now we've trapped this colour under the heat embossing, we can then add further colour around the embossing, and the embossing is going to resist this. So I'm using a selection of Catherine Pooler inks in Party Dress, Sangria and Juniper Mist to add some ink blending to the card panel. Using blending tools with a foam sponge, I'm creating a gradient ink blend between the colours. First of all, I'm starting off with Party Dress at the top. So as you add the colour and when you hit the heat embossing is going to resist the ink. But as we use clear gloss, we can still see the pink of the card shining through that heat embossing. After Party Dress, I'm going to ink up with Sangria ink, and I'm blending this 2/3 of the way down the card panel. Then at the bottom, I'm using Juniper Mist ink, and I'm going back between the colours to smooth out the blending, using circular motions to apply the ink. Once I'm happy with the ink blending, I'm using a dry cloth to just buff over the embossing. This will wipe away any excess ink that sits on top of the heat embossing. This technique is great if you want to keep a light colour and then create a darker background. This technique is great when you want to keep your stamping as a light colour and then create a darker background. Okay, for the second technique, we are going to trap coloured ink instead this time. So for this card, I'm using the Round and Round stamp from Embossing Powder, and I've positioned this in my Misty along with a piece of white card. So I'm using the same 3 ink colours again, and I'm inking the stamp up with Juniper Mist ink on one end and Party Dress ink on the other end. To add the Sangria ink and to create a smooth transition from one colour to another, I'm applying the ink with a blending tool. This will blend the ink onto the stamp, and it will blend with the ink that's already on the stamp, reducing any harsh lines that may be seen. So as you can see, once it is stamped, you have a nice colour gradient in your stamping. Now I'm repeating this again for you to see. So I'm inking up one end with Juniper Mist, then the other end with Party Dress, and then next I'm going in with my blending tool to add the Sangria ink in the middle, blending it with the colours either side. To trap this colour, we need to cover it with embossing powder. So after I've cleaned my stamp up, I'm inking it with my clear ultra slow dry embossing ink and stamping right over the top again. I can then cover this with clear embossing powder once more, and as with the previous technique, the clear gloss powder, as it melts, traps that colour of ink underneath it. So we have now trapped the gradient ink stamping we created with 3 colours of ink. The stamping and heat embossing was repeated to fill up the card panel, moving the stamp design over to the side each time and aligning the ink colours up to carry on that gradient ink stamping. Again, this heat embossing allows us to add ink over the top, and know that the ink underneath the heat embossing isn't going to be affected. So I'm adding the same colours of ink from right to left in the opposite gradient to that we stamped in. The heat embossing resists the ink as we blend over, so the trapped colours of ink beneath shine through. So I'm starting with Party Dress on the left, going in with Sangria, and then I've got Juniper Mist on the right, blending these on with a circular motion. Once all the ink blending is complete, I'm using my dry cloth again to buff the heat embossing to remove any excess ink that is sitting over the top of the heat embossing. For the last technique, we are going to trap colour, but instead of using clear gloss, we are going to use white pearl embossing powder. For this card, I'm using the Lush Vines background stamp from PinkFresh Studios, and as this is a cling stamp, I'm removing the foam pad from my Misty stamping platform in order to stamp the design. I will want to stamp this several times, and to make sure that my card panel stays in the middle of the stamp, as I can't use a magnet with this stamp, I'm just applying some repositionable tape on the back before placing it in my Misty. Again, I'm using the same colour of inks to stamp this, and I'm using my blending tool again to smooth out the blending between the colours. I've got Juniper Mist at the top, then I've got Sangria, and then I've got Party Dress. However, later on when I actually use the panel, I turn it upside down. As I've applied repositionable tape to the panel, it means I know I can restamp it once more in the same place, as the tape has prevented it from moving. Again, I'm inking it up twice with the inks just to get that bright colour. And then once I've done that, I can clean my stamp and then stamp it with my embossing ink. So for this background, instead of using the clear gloss embossing powder like I have done in the previous two techniques, I'm covering it with white pearl embossing powder. White pearl embossing powder will take on the colour beneath it. So as we're trapping the colour of ink, it is not only going to trap the colour, but it's going to turn it a pearl colour at the same time. So as you heat set it, you can see we have a gradient pearl heat embossing design. Pearl embossing powder will also work with Emboss Resist. So this time I'm using my blending tool to add Catherine Pooler Blackjack ink over the top. As the pearl embossing powder catches the light on this background, the pearl colours really pop against the grey. Now we've looked at the three techniques, let's turn all these into 3 cards. For the first card, I've used the Birch Press Designs Big Hello Sugar Script die cutting the hello 3 times out of Gina K Slate cardstock, and layering this up with a white shadowed die cut piece. The card panel was trimmed down and added to a white card base, and then a sentiment from the Altenew Sentiments Strips 2 stamp set was foam mounted onto the card. I've stamped this in blackjack ink just to tie in with the die cut sentiment. For the second card, I've die cut a stitched heart out of white cardstock, and this has been foam mounted onto the card panel offset to one side. A layered love die cut from Birch Press Designs was added to the front in slate cardstock, and a heat embossed sentiment was added underneath. This sentiment comes from the Round and Round stamp set. For the last card, I've die cut the Altenew Fancy Thanks 3 times to layer this up for dimension. And to add a little bit more interest, I'm just ink blending some Party Dress ink to the bottom and fading this out. I've used the pearl heat embossed background to die cut a large stitched heart from, and then I'm foam mounting this onto a white card base, trimming off any excess of the heart that overhangs the edge. Another sentiment from the Sentiment Strips 2 stamp set was then added to the card just to finish the sentiment off. For all 3 cards, I'm embellishing the cards with a selection of sequins from Lucy's Cards. These were in a sequin mix called Aurora Borealis, and I'm using my pickup tool along with Gina K Connect Glue to secure them in place. All 3 techniques are fun ways to trap colour within your paper crafts, and the colour combinations are endless. There is no doubt that I had fun with this colour scheme, and I can't decide which is my favourite. If you've got a favourite, just let me know in the comments below, as I'd love to know. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up and why not subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that bell icon to be notified when the next video is up. If you'd like to check out my personal channel, Pretty Little Button, I've included a link here as well as down below. For 10% discount at the Wow Embossing Powder shop, just enter the code you can see on screen. Also, why not check out this other video for some more inspiration. Until next time, happy crafting!